But because you have to have some really major changes in the way we are living on the planet, and that's going to take a whole lot more to changes there to get there.
Hello, I'm Lane Hartzell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm here with George Wuerthner, an ecologist and wildlife activist, currently the executive director of Public Lands Media. He's a former director of ecological projects for the Foundation for Deep Ecology. As a wildlife activist, he helped to reintroduce wolves back into the wild. In Montana, he has written 38 books on environmental issues, on natural history. For example, Energy, the Delusion of Endless Growth and Overdevelopment. I need to read this one. Wildfires, A Century of Failed Policy, Welfare Ranching, and many others. Welcome, George. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Hi. Good morning or evening where you are.
When we first, we're doing a series here. So George and I talked about public lands in the last one about a month and a half ago, I guess. We looked at the extraordinary history. I mean, it's extraordinary. The United States at the late 19th century, going back to that time, John Muir, Abraham Lincoln, the public parks, land, which you're an expert in. And then there was also one that we talked about last time with the politicians in Arizona wanting to develop the land, basically, kind of this capitalist kind of thing. And then Teddy Roosevelt, right, was in
Yes.
Washington, and let's pick up from there where he just signed it off, and
Okay. I'll
let's
tell
pick
the
up from
story.
there, and then we're going to move on to Alaska
Okay.
and talk about this. Yeah.
The the Antiquities Act, which was passed in 1906 when Teddy Roosevelt was president, was designed to protect small, Indian ruins and other sites like that, particularly because a lot of them were being looted at the time. And so the Antiquities Act was passed so that the president could protect such sites by giving them a special designation called a national monument. And those sites then would be presumably off limits to things like pottery stealing and other things that were being done at the time. So anyway, Roosevelt also had been lobbying for a while to try to get the Grand Canyon designated as a national park. And there was resistance in Arizona at the time from, we're talking about just the turn of the century, and it was still the Wild West in many ways in Western states, in the sense of the whole purpose of humans being there was to find resources and develop them and try to get rich. And so the idea of setting aside something like the Grand Canyon was something that the locals were totally opposed to. So in effect, he had this Antiquities Act, and he asked his attorney general if there was any size limit to an area that could be declared by the president as a national monument. And the attorney general read the act and said, well, there's nothing that says how big or how little a national monument has to be. And he supposedly said, well, then I so declare, I can't remember the exact, I think it was 1,000,000 acres of Arizona
Like
as the
that.
Grand Canyon National Monument. And of course, the state was totally against this. The legislature was outraged, and the senators from the state tried to get around this. And this is a little bit of the history. They introduced a bill in the Congress to make the Grand Canyon a national park, and people have to understand only Congress can create national parks. But what their bill would do is significantly reduce the size of the Grand Canyon National Monument. So for people that weren't aware of what was going on or only had a sort of a tangential understanding, people were all for creating national parks. So they thought, well, this is a great thing. But in effect, it actually shrank the size of the national monument significantly. And over the years, Grand Canyon has been expanded in both by national monument expansion as well as national park expansion, and so it's now larger than what Teddy Roosevelt set aside. But it was originally.
I'm sorry I begin to laugh before the punchline, and it's a bit of a disservice to our listeners because I already know what's coming and what Roosevelt was going to do by signing that and say, okay,
Yeah.
this million acres is locked off, and then he signs what did he sign a decree that no, that you can't limit or that you have to limit the size next time or something like that.
No, that was on national forests
Oh, that was
too.
national forest. Okay.
Yeah. And but the punchline I was going to say is, by the first time that the U.S. government shut down years ago, the all the national parks were closed, and the state of Arizona, which initially was against the whole idea of a Grand Canyon National Park, funded the Park Service to keep the Grand Canyon open. So, there's this, and this is a switch I see all the time,
Sure.
and it's an important thing for conservationists to keep in mind, and that is, even if there's initial opposition to some protected status, whether it's a national park or a wilderness area or whatever the legislation may be, oftentimes the people living there eventually come around and become supporters of that designation,
Sure.
and protectors of it. But even though initially they may be opposed to the concept, so if you take the long view, and we're going to talk about the parks in Alaska here in a minute. And when they were designated in the 1980s by Jimmy Carter, signing legislation to create all the parks and refuges in Alaska, I mean, he was hung in effigy in towns up there. When I worked in the Gates of the Arctic, there was bumper stickers: "Save a moose, kill a ranger." Stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty a lot of hostility to any of this stuff.
Right.
And today, the towns tourism is the second biggest thing in Alaska these days, in terms of employment and so forth. And you would never get anybody, they may have disagreements about how the parks are run and things like, or should we be allowed to, kill wolves or something like that. But nobody would seriously say, let's get rid of all the national parks in Alaska. That's past. So this is something to keep in mind.
Well, as you mentioned, let's talk more specifically then about this contemporary case, like now. In fact, you were just in Alaska about a month ago. Yep. Gates of the Arctic National Park. I mean, this is just an extraordinary place. You served as a ranger there. Can you first describe the land? Just
sure.
Try to capture the beauty as best you can in words.
Okay.
You're right.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'll start out in the bigger part. The Brooks Range is the most northern mountain range of its size. It's over 700 miles long and averages about 150 miles wide. And it's all north of the Arctic Circle. And it stretches all the way from the Yukon border to the Bering Sea across northern Alaska. And the Gates of the Arctic is about the central part of that, but there's all sorts of other protected areas. So on the east, you have the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, and that Arctic Wildlife Refuge border goes right up to the Pipeline Haul Road on its western border, and immediately across the Pipeline Haul Road, the Gates of the Arctic National Park starts. And then there's the Noatak Preserve in the western part. There's the Kobuk Valley National Park. There are various large wildlife refuges also adjacent to it. So anyway, the Gates of the Arctic is approximately a little over 8 million acres in size, which, to give a comparison, Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. So about 4 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. And it encompasses both the north and south slope of the Brooks Range, and there's a significant ecological difference. The south slope is forested with spruce and aspen and paper birch. The north slope is all tundra essentially. You have willows along the creeks and that kind of thing, but there's no forested areas north of the Arctic Divide. and the whole area was heavily glaciated during the last ice age. Although glaciers were smaller there than they were further south because there was no access to water during the ice age. The Arctic Ocean was frozen entirely, the Bering Sea was frozen entirely, and so moisture had to cross the other mountain ranges further south, that is, air masses with moisture, like the Chugach Range, the Alaska Range, and Wrangels, etc., in order to get moisture and snow to the Brooks Range. And even today, the Brooks Range is considerably drier than other areas further south.
Mhm.
And although you wouldn't know that being there in the summertime because the permafrost that underlies most of the landscape prevents water from running off. So when you walk up there across the tundra, you almost always have wet feet. And so, anyway, and it has your typical Arctic species, Dall sheep, which are white sheep that are found in the far north, moose, caribou, grizzly bears, black bears, um, and then wolverine, marten, and other smaller fur bearers. And the rivers coming out of the gates of the Arctic, some of them have salmon runs, and the lakes, particularly larger lakes, have lake trout in them and grayling, and so it's a large landscape that, other than landing strips, and there are a few, is pretty much in the condition that you would have said it was 200 years ago or whatever.
Just a quick aside, Kodiak bears, are they farther inland than the
They are
grizzly
down. They get their name from Kodiak Island,
from down?
down on the coast.
I see.
And Kodiak bears is sort of a reference to coastal grizzly bears. They're the same
Ah,
species as you would have up north,
I
but
see.
they're, because they get to feed on salmon, they tend to get a lot bigger,
I see.
and they have a longer season when they're out. The bears, the grizzlies that are found in like the gates of the Arctic are relatively small. They're still pretty big when you see one, but
Right, right.
close up, but relatively small compared to the bears along the coast. And they much more, the population density is much lower than it is down in the coastal areas.
I
So
see. I see.
yeah,
Let me let me just do a role play with you. Let me quote President Trump on this particular project and building roads and get your response. President Trump says, "We built a road that's over 200 miles long through a very beautiful area of the world." I mean, clearly true. He told reporters, this is like just last Monday, "It's incredible when you look at it, but a rough area from the standpoint of building." And then he goes on to say that this will release billions and billions, the usual rhetoric that he has, of dollars in wealth. Pretty amazing when you think of it. It's wealth we're going to need to be the number one country. We're number one country now in AI. You've probably read. I'm actually quoting him, so it's a bit disjointed how he talks. We're
of
beating
course.
everybody with AI levels that nobody ever thought even possible. Anyway, can I ask you to respond to this, please?
Sure. Well, let me give you a little more background on it so people understand it. The road that's being proposed would go from the Pipeline Haul Road, which exists, taking oil from Prudhoe Bay down to Valdez, and it would cross the southern edge of the Brooks Range, including through parts of the Gates of the Arctic National Park and crossing a bunch of wild and scenic rivers and other special designated areas to access copper mines near the headwaters of the Kobuk River.
Okay.
And this road has been on the drawing board forever. When the Alaska Lands Bill passed, there was a clause in it when the Gates of the Arctic was designated. It said there will be a legal right of way across the national park. So they've been planning to build a road at some point across here forever. And the state, which also got to select lands throughout the state as part of their settlement, um, has a lot of land along the whole route of the proposed road, so that because the state is always for development, and by acquiring that land, they have been pushing for a road there too, and the so you know the whole thing of the deposits are primarily copper, but there's gold and lead and all sorts of other stuff there too. And it's a belt of about 70 miles long of some of the richest copper deposits in the world. Some claim the richest. The idea is he's correct that there will be a lot of dollars created from this if it is built. And the main thing that has stymied development of these deposits has been the high cost of getting the ore out of there to someplace where it can be smelted. And what would happen if this road is built to the mines? The ore would be trucked back on this road to the Alaska Pipeline Haul Road, and then they would drive south all the way to Valdez, Alaska, which is a ice-free port. That's why the oil pipeline ends there. And then they would transport it. In my understanding, I think they're going to transport it to China for smelting. But I don't know what Trump would say about that. But anyway,
I think now probably there's a tariff now, 100%.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe he'll put something in there that says has to be smelted in the United States. I don't know. But anyway, but that's the general plan. And the value of those copper deposits has increased because copper is one of the essential minerals that are used in a lot of electronics, and especially if we have more electronic vehicles and so forth, the need for copper has risen. And my response is, I mean, I don't like to see large open pit copper mines any place, frankly, but there are places that the disruption and ecological impact could be less if you were going to have, and even any place else they're going to be proposed, they're still going to be controversial. For example, there's a proposal for a copper mine in Arizona right now, a couple of new ones actually, and at the same time, because the infrastructure is already there, in other words, the highways and so forth, the towns where people can live in are there. All that would have to be developed new in this area, which is extremely difficult to work in and dark half of the year and colder than.
You said you anything. Were there. You were there like last year or something, and a bag of potato chips is like $20. Something
right,
like
right. In one of the villages, on the Potomac River.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is an expensive place to live, and the villagers. There are a number of villages along the route of the road or near the road that have mixed feelings. Some and you have to understand the politics. Okay, the copper deposits themselves are largely owned by the Eskimo Corporation, NANA, N-A-N-A, and the road goes across lands or near lands that are owned by on the eastern part, owned by Athabascan Indians, who will, they will get no financial advantage from having the road cross their lands in that area because they don't own the copper deposit. So the Inuit people who own the copper deposits, there are a lot of them are for this development because there's significant financial returns they expect from it, and also there will be some other indirect effects. For example, many of them will get jobs probably at the copper mines, and they'll be high-paying jobs.
Hello, I'm Lane Hartzell with the Korea IT Times, and I'm back with George Wuerthner, and we're discussing the copper mining getting ready to go in Alaska. So welcome back, George. You were talking about the jobs that are going in up there, the high-paying jobs. Can you continue on with that?
Sure. Yeah. The support for the mining proposal, there's no mines there. Exploration has been done and so forth. So. But the goal would be to have large open pit mines, and many of the people living in the region, and including further from the region, the state of Alaska in general, see the development of these mines as being a big economic boost to both the local villagers as well as the state of Alaska in general. And as previously said, the opportunities in a lot of these small villages for work are pretty limited. Most of the people living in these villages, to the degree when they do work, is they take on seasonal jobs. They might go commercial fishing. They may go to there's a big mine called the Red Dog Mine, operated by the Nana Corporation on the Bering Sea, a little north of Kotzebue, that provides good paying jobs and so forth. So, or they work up on the pipeline, whatever they can do, where you can do short term work and make a lot of money, and then they go back to the villages. And so this is seen as an economic shot in the arm. And like a lot of operations with mining in particular, or the oil in Prudhoe Bay, it's a short term economic shot in the arm. That is one of the problems with all these kinds of developments. Eventually you run out of the copper, you run out of the oil, or whatever. The state of Alaska, in fact, is facing that problem with oil development, which is why they're pushing very hard for more oil drilling in what is called the National Petroleum Reserve. Used to be Naval Petroleum Reserve, National Petroleum Reserve, which is just north of where the copper mining would happen. Which, by the way, brings up another issue, which is if you put in a road someplace, the road is like a cancer. Is the best way I can describe it, because then it makes it easier to do more development. So, for example, the oil that's in the petroleum reserve north of where these mines are would become more economical to develop if you could extend a road from the mines northwards into that area. Who knows whether that would ever happen, but that's one of the kinds of things that happens. For example, if it wasn't for the fact that the pipeline haul road already exists, which this proposed Ambler mining road proposal would connect to, there wouldn't be any discussion about the Ambler road, because it would be too expensive to build a road all the way to Valdez. So anyway, you have to realize that all sorts of other development can happen when you have a road. It just spreads the impact through the region.
I see. So, they're supposed to put a road in for just mining, but then all the other stuff comes with it.
It could come with it. In other words, if you go look at the coastal of Alaska, the original Prudhoe Bay development was focused on a small area right on the coast, and now there's all sorts of tentacles off of that main road and development east and west to develop more oil pads. And so there's roads and pipelines that lead back to Prudhoe Bay and then connect to the pipeline itself to take the oil south. So it's just the point that once you get one major road in, it's a lot easier to have additional side roads built.
Oh, got it. I got it. So we've been talking about the Ambler Road project in Alaska at the gates of the Arctic National Park, where George was a ranger, and the Brooks Range foothills. I wanted to ask you more about, you were telling me in another conversation about there's places you can go in and you can get to the copper easier than, say, in other places. And the argument would be, well, it would be better to go ahead and take it in a certain area, in a concentrated area, rather than, say, destroying a whole. Can you talk more about this kind of logic?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like I'm promoting development in one area over another to that all development has impacts, is my point. But the existing areas with copper, where there are well-known copper deposits in regions where there's already roads, where there's already communities where people who work at the copper mines can live in, where there's all this other infrastructure that doesn't have to be developed. It's already had its impact, is my point. In other words, the roads are already there, the housing's there, and so forth. So the cumulative impacts are lessened because of that. There's fewer cumulative impacts than putting development in an entirely new area. And the other part of it is the Arctic is such a severe place climatically that impacts can mm, can be exaggerated or have a greater impact because of the climate limits growth of plants and the ability of the ecosystem to recover from such things. And that adds another factor into the whole consideration. So, in any event, there's you have to look at, is there really a better alternative if you start with the assumption we're going to have mine copper someplace. You say to yourself, well, where is the best place to do that? It's sort of the same argument. I'll make an analogy. I would say, for the most part, the Western United States is a lousy place to be grazing livestock because of the aridity of the landscape. So that that livestock grazing has bigger impacts in the West than it does in other parts of the country. That doesn't mean if you're growing cows in Georgia, there aren't impacts,
Right.
but they are lesser. They're small. The impacts are smaller, and the impacts environmentally can be coped with easier because you have a more favorable climate where it rains and so forth. So that's the kind of analogy I'm trying to make, is that there are better and worse places to do development.
Right, right. I got you. Um, in the case of, let me say here, like say Chile is a major producer of copper, right? Something like, seems like 30% comes to my mind, but I'm not sure if that's correct or not. But it's a major producer of copper. What happens if, say, there's delays on these mines, and then the material scientists can come along with something better than copper? So I had mentioned this to you. And in some of my work, I talk about rematerialization, like mining what we already have or developing new materials into something better. What's your opinion on this?
Well, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I'm always a proponent of delaying these massive new projects, because there's
Mhm.
always the hope that either the need for the product, whatever it is
Or the
that you're
need,
going
right?
after, oil or copper or whatever, might decline for some reason, or the other aspect is some substitute is created, or a better, more efficient. Let's just say copper. Let's say there was some way um, to improve the ability of copper to conduct electricity over and above the way it is today. So then you would need less copper.
Right.
And so there's all these trade-offs you can make, and oftentimes, and that's the kind of the history of the human race, of looking at developing more efficient ways to exploit.
True.
But sometimes the more efficient ways have less impact. So
Or
that could happen.
they develop something better, but then the add-on, like this Jevons paradox, we get more and more
Right,
on top of
right.
the other, you know?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. That's exactly one of the problems. And I hesitate to be too much of an advocate. I mean, my main thing is we should be trying to figure out how we can use less, and
Exactly. Sure.
maybe not have to have these developments in the first place. The starting assumption of people that are advocates of resource exploitation, somebody like Donald Trump, is, well, we just need to have more. And there's a difference between need and what people think they want, and so a lot of times there are alternatives that could reduce the presumed need for developing these resources. I'll give you one example. Of course, that's very common today, is recycling paper.
Mhm.
And so, because you're recycling the paper, you have less demand for the original, logging of the forest to get the same substance. So that's an example.
In some materials like aluminum, you have to have, well, you don't have to have, but to to to, to take out the bauxite and then process it and all that stuff into new aluminum is better for new technology, like say aircraft, compared to like the recycling they already have, which is like at 100% already. So there's still got to be bauxite mining to do, what's happening here. So we've got 100% recycling, right, on aluminum,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, more or less 95%. So we're already doing this mining that I'm talking about. We're mining, remining, rematerializing aluminum, but you still got to have this massive bauxite mining going on.
Well, I mean, we could take that to ultimate causes. Their population growth of humans is increasing. Therefore, all things being equal, there's probably the same amount of aluminum cans being produced.
Right, right.
But there's more people using those aluminum cans and so forth. So yeah, that ultimately is one of the problems that has to be addressed at some point. And I would say that I don't know enough about the aluminum situation to make a serious comment on it, other than to say that a lot of times there are alternatives, and one of the alternatives is just to see how you can do the same thing with less, and often that's not considered because there are all sorts of institutional barriers to changing.
Mhm.
Um, and institutional and reasons why people don't want to do it. I'll give it. This is not maybe the best analogy, but I'll use it. I had a friend that used to build uh, hay bale homes, and hay bale homes, according to him, are really well insulated. They're relatively inexpensive to build because you build a frame and then you put the hay bales in between, and then you put stucco or something on the outside of it to seal it. And when he was trying to do hay bale homes, uh, no banks would loan on it because it was a non-traditional material.
Right,
So the only people he could do this for were people who were very wealthy and didn't need to get a mortgage from a bank.
right.
So the only reason hay bale homes were never popular was partly this institutional barrier. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. There's incentives a lot of times to keep doing the same old thing because there's a lot of people that are dependent on doing the same old thing that way, and so we find ourselves delaying changes until it's overwhelming. But that's the other thing, as I see a lot of times, is that when some kind of new technology comes along or something like that, it takes a while for it to take hold. But then once it does, it can be very rapid. Of course, I'm thinking of like cell phones. I mean, I go around. I remember this summer I saw a phone booth somewhere. So I can't remember where. And
Oh,
yeah, and it still worked. I took a picture of it. But my kids don't know what a telephone booth is. Because they've grown up
Superman.
the
I
whole
mean,
time.
the
Yeah,
Superman.
they had cell phones the whole time, right? So I was joking with him. You guys.
I still remember phone booths.
Yeah, yeah, right. And you're searching to make sure you have a dime or a quarter or whatever they
A
cost
dime,
to make
exactly.
a phone call. Yeah.
Or you call
So
the
anyway,
operator.
yeah. so so anyway, but it takes one of the same thing is like the transition to electric cars. One of the things that limits that transition, which is happening, but is you need charging stations. So until you get enough charging stations in enough places, a lot of people are reluctant to give up, totally gasoline powered cars for that reason. But once there is enough, then I think you're going to see a big flip.
I think that I think the argument here is that obviously we're talking about the real world, where we do have copper mining and we do have these other things. But if we could, at least in a somewhat practical manner, start to reduce the major impactful things, like I was talking about cruise ships recently and these big football stadiums and this herding the cows in the arid regions, and eating meat and this kind of thing. Education of women, as far as population goes. A lot of this stuff is doable and
Right.
not expensive.
Yes.
What do you think?
Well, that I agree entirely with that. That a lot of change. I'll talk about the meat eating because that's something I've written a lot about, livestock raising and so
Right.
forth, and um and a reduction in meat consumption. I never proselytize to people, oh, you got to stop eating all meat because you know people aren't likely to do that if they're used to it. But you can argue, how about having a little less meat? And when I was a kid, my family had meat at every dinner practically of some
When I
sort.
was young, yeah.
Yeah, and so if you were to reduce that to 2 times a week or 3 times a week, and that was done by enough people, that starts to make a significant impact.
Yeah.
And it's one of the easiest things, by the way. Livestock are one of the major sources of carbon, emissions into the atmosphere, and and that was one of the most easiest things that people as individuals can do to reduce climate change gases. And so, there are some things, I'm not going to probably figure out how to, get people to stop using gasoline or whatever, but deciding not to eat hamburgers every day can make a difference, and your health will be better too. So yeah, there are things that are easier than others to do. And I don't, in this whole discussion, I'm always a little uncomfortable because people might misinterpret me to be thinking that technology is going to save us, kind of idea, and that's not what I'm trying to say. Uh, but because you have to have some really major changes in the way we are living on the planet, and that's going to take a whole lot more to changes there to get there. But in the meantime, there are still things that can be done and that can lessen individual and collective impacts on the planet.
Yeah, yeah. When I hear you talking about the individual part, I don't hear you saying that, let's only focus on the individual, because your work is really about public lands and this larger social action that has to come. But if people want to maybe reduce some meat eating, I do myself, and
Mm-hmm.
if they want to put solar panels in their house, that's a little better. It's still a
Right,
fossil fuel system,
right.
there's also this aspect, George, that you've done tremendous work in with actual public action and social action out there. You know, people, it takes a lot of people to get into these movements and to get this governmental, this machinery of government working in a right direction. This grassroots democracy, whatever you want to call it. I mean, this is something that's impressive about your work.
Well, I'm a big advocate of protecting wild nature, and the human footprint on the planet is huge, and in my view, uh, that's why I'm such a staunch advocate of protecting every last acre, so to speak, of any kind of natural areas, because we've already so transformed the planet, and I don't have to go into a whole litany of reasons why that may be a good idea. That from both a human perspective as well as a planetary perspective, in the sense that I feel like um, as a species we can be aware of what we're doing, and therefore we have an ethical duty to consider our impacts on all the other life on the planet. And getting back to livestock, between livestock and agriculture, plant growing crops, there's some figures like only of biomass on the earth between humans and our livestock. We're 96% of the land biomass out there.
Sure.
So the room for everything else, from grizzly bears to elephants to birds, etc., is very limited, and therefore we need to not only reduce our input, but we need to expand the landscapes that we reserve and try to preserve for everything else on the
Do
planet.
do you think the American tradition of this, national parks and national forests can, I mean, it has gone global, right? But how can we expand this? If you're just someone looking in, watching this video.
Well, the good thing is that, at least in terms, as you point out, national parks in particular or other reserves have caught on around the globe, and that you don't have to make that argument anymore that this is something that's desirable.
Exactly, it's
It's just
there.
that it has become now more of a question of how much and where we do this. And so working upon the idea that it's desirable, and I think I mentioned earlier in the interview about how in Alaska, when the Alaska Lands Bill passed, Jimmy Carter was hung in effigy, and there was incredible hostility to national parks in
Right,
Alaska.
right.
But today, that hostility does not exist, and so I think that that offers a lot of promise for expanding these protected areas. And we're getting pushback, and particularly in there are problems you have to address. In places in the globe where there are a lot of poverty and human misery. There's this clash between should we protect this land for tigers or something, or how's that going to impact villagers trying to have one cow and that's all they have to live on, and it might get eaten by a tiger or something. Um, those those trade-offs have to be addressed, but I think that we still have to take in mind that humans have much more adaptability than the animals and plants do. And we can be creative, hopefully, in our solutions to these problems if people want to really solve them. And so I sort of come at it with the idea that we need to expand. E.O. Wilson talked about having 50% of the planet in some sort of preserved and protected status.
Half Earth.
And, yeah, half Earth, right?
What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a great goal. You got to have goals, It's just sort of like, the United States has this stated goal from that there's, all people, of course, it was men. All men are created equal. Of course, now we talk about all people are created equal in terms of human rights. And we still don't have that in the United States, but we are certainly better today than we were 200 years ago when those words were first, put down on paper. And so it's a goal that's out there and you work towards it continuously. And you have, there's the old saying, was it 2 steps forward, 1 step back? And right now we're maybe making 2 steps back here in the United States. But overall, I like to think that we're making that progress, and that progress will continue in terms of human rights and so forth. But it's the same thing with protecting global ecosystems and so forth. We need to have a goal that's out there that pushes us to really, try hard to reach new plateaus or so forth. This is a personal analogy. I almost never, I've climbed a lot of mountains. I mean, not climbed, just walk up, not the person on the side of the cliff, but I've gone up a lot of mountains, and and I almost never start out with the idea I'm going to go to the top of that peak. If because a lot of times I'm like, man, that's a long ways. I don't think I can make it. But what I'll do, I play this game with my mind. I said, well, I'll go to that ridge line there, and I get up to the ridge line and I'm like, well, that wasn't so bad. I'll go to that knob there. And I get up to that knob and then I'm like, well, it's not that far to the summit. And so you do it in, psychologically stages like that. And you actually get to the peak. But maybe if you didn't have, the peak out there, you wouldn't even try to begin with, and you do it in stages. And that's how I see the whole idea of the half Earth concept being adopted is in stages, not overnight, but something that we strive for.
Yeah, something I've argued. Actually, I've argued with Derek about this, and we actually agree that it's going to be difficult to have, this. I call it megapolitron, this vast city system network that's already in place and all of these people moving into it. It'd have to be some kind of thing where it would be half Earth with a lot of wildland, but maybe the indigenous model or bioregional model, worked in with this, city network system, something like that. It's some idea.
Well, the way people think about it in stages, and you have your core areas where the human impacts are totally minimized. And then you have buffer zones called buffer zones around those core areas where you allow some things that maybe are still detrimental, but it doesn't totally, it's not a total loss of naturalness. And then you get to the areas where, human impact is greatest. That just happens naturally. I mean, I studied geography for a long time, but look at something like if you go to California, you have the Los Angeles. So, well, that's a core area of a lot of impact. But you go 50, 100 miles out of Los Angeles, and you're out in the Mojave Desert where there's a minimal of human
Right.
impact. So you can see easily. We just naturally create these kinds of zonings, and maybe we could use a little more thought process and how and why we do it, and to maximize the effectiveness. In other words, that's one of the purposes of doing studies. I was involved in a study a long time ago of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The whole thing was to determine biological hotspots. And I won't go into the whole thing of how we did it, but we determined what parts of the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem had the most biological importance, and then we rated them on how endangered or threatened they were. And this information was then used to try to help identify areas that you get the most bang for buck if you
can
protect it.
minimize the impact.
Yeah, yes, and so not all lands are equal in terms of biological importance, and not all species are equally threatened, and so forth. So you can use some sort of zoning system like that to maximize the areas that are protected, and still have, for better or for worse, a lot of places where humans can exist and still go about at least a lot of their daily lives. So, and part of it is changing the way people are too. I gotta tell one more story because,
Sure.
One of the things that I think are great about national parks is they really do change the way people act out there.
Sure.
I go to parks all the time, particularly a lot of time in Yellowstone, and uh, people, they see a grizzly bear off in the distance or whatever. They tend to be respectful and stay at distance. Not everybody does, but the
I've
majority of
seen some
people,
videos that
yeah,
they
but
walk up to that creature, and I'm like,
yeah, right.
oh,
Exactly. There are the exceptions, but the majority of people, follow that idea. We don't want to push this animal. We don't want to disturb it much.
right, right.
And you'll be out there, and people are looking through spotting scopes and binoculars, and they're all excited to see the wolf or the bison or whatever.
Mhm.
And politics disappears. There's all those people there. There's Trumpers out there. There's
Everybody.
left wingers all out there watching the wildlife, but you wouldn't know the politics at all
Right.
because that disappears. Everybody's excited to be seeing the wildlife there and enjoying Yellowstone National Park. And I think that's one of the great things about the parks is that they help to bring us together, and people of all kinds of political persuasions and wealth. I mean, you could have some guy there driving an old beat up pickup truck, and another person in a very expensive vehicle right next to him. So, and that's one of the things. To me, parks are a very democratizing kind of concept. And are they available to everybody? I'll be the first to admit, the overall middle class to wealthy is what you see in national parks. But that doesn't mean we should get rid of them.
Right,
Just
right,
like I use universities as an example. The vast majority of students at universities are middle class to wealthy. What we need to do is try to help the people that are not as financially wealthy to attend universities, not get rid of universities because they're not perfect in the people that are there. And that's the way I see parks as too. And there are things that could be done that would increase. One is just having more parks near major urban
Mhm.
areas,
Mhm.
which so I did a rough review. This is U.S. Thing, but almost every major urban area in the United States has national parks near them. I mean, it's surprising people, reasonable distance. Like San Francisco has the Golden Gate National Recreation Area right there in town
Right
and
in the
right
city.
north of town. Yeah, and then you have the Gateway National Park outside of New York City. You have the Boston Islands off of Boston, Minuteman, National Historic Site. You have the Miami. You have the Everglades and Biscayne National Park, this Biscayne Bay National Park. You can go down through the list. LA has all kinds of the San Gabriel Mountains National Monument, and San Diego has a couple of park units. The point being, Tucson has Saguaro National Park. I can go on and on. Um, but we could use more. But the point still is that most parks have, you can be in San Francisco and go to Golden Gate National Recreational Areas, on the city bus, and you're in a national park unit and so forth. So more of that would be great, but it's a way for even people that don't have a lot of money to experience park units. And then you have places that are more remote, like Yellowstone, that requires, or the Gates of the Arctic requires a financial investment. And maybe it's a once in a lifetime experience instead of something that you do every day.
Well, thanks, George. I've been speaking with George Wuerthner, ecologist and wildlife activist. He's executive director of Public Lands Media. Thanks again.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Thank you.